Hi, this is Dr. Karen Wilson Starks, your host for the Voice of Leadership and for Dr. Karen Speaks Leadership. And today I want to share my advice and counsel to the presidential candidates in the United States who are running for the office of president. At the time of this recording, we have a number of situations going on. The Republican National Convention has already taken place, and former President Donald Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party. Also, not too long ago, he just narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. We also have going on right now that Democratic President Joe Biden has dropped out of the presidential race, and this under intense pressure and scrutiny from party leaders because of how he responded in the debate with former President Donald Trump. So we have Vice President Kamala Harris stepping in and being supported by a number of Democrats and the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. However, the Democratic National Convention has not yet taken place at this time. And then we still have an independent candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's still in the race and is on some state ballots, though having some challenges getting on all the state ballots because there are some additional hurdles for someone who is an independent. And he was not included in the debate with President Biden and former President Donald Trump. So today, as I share some of my views and perspectives, you may or may not agree with what I'm talking about. And what I'm hoping is that we can have a discourse over the topic. And if you have a different perspective, please feel free to reach out. You may share it on the social media channels, or you may reach out to me directly at Karen at transleadership.com. There used to be a time, and I hope still we have a time like this in the United States where we can have differing opinions, be willing to listen to one another, hear each other's perspectives without trying to murder each other by word or even with firearms and other weapons. So hopefully we can do that. I also want to remind you of an episode, which is episode 485, that I did with Deke Copenhaver, who is the former mayor of Augusta, Georgia. He and I talked a little bit about the political landscape as well, and he talked about strategies for dealing with polarization in the United States. And we certainly have issues with polarization. So lots of ways that we can look at this. Now, if you happen to be listening and you're from outside of the United States, there are some aspects of what I'm going to say that apply to any situation where there's an opportunity to vote in a real way for your candidates. So please do figure out which part is relevant for you. And if you have some perspectives, because in your country, there are some other variables and you want to share those, then feel free to do that as well. So in this segment about my advice and counsel to U.S. presidential candidates, I want to just mention first that in recent years in the United States political history, we have had a lot of what I'm going to call attack campaigns against opponents. And this is more than a focus on the issues. Instead, there's been a lot of attacks on people themselves, and that's problematic. We've also had a high use of fear tactics more than inspiring the American people. So a lot of the campaigns are not inspiration based. What has made this country successful in the past is an abundance mindset and a belief that we can accomplish our big goals and objectives. And we know that the kind of fear that people are promulgating is the type of fear that paralyzes people. So they're no longer thinking about possibilities and how to move forward. So that's been our recent landscape. And we want to get past that and get to a new place. So number one, my advice and counsel to the candidates is this. You want to cast a positive vision of hope and possibility about where and how you will lead the country so that Americans are better off under your leadership, so that the world is better off under your leadership. And a vision is a future focused picture of what you see ahead. It's got to appeal to the broad populace, not just to a narrow segment of society. And that's if you want to win the presidential race in the United States. Now, I'm going to talk about each of the candidates to some extent, and I'm going to spend a lot more time on former President Donald Trump because he's had more time on the campaign trail to develop his ideas about Make America Great Again. Now, I mentioned I'd be speaking very personally today, and I'm going to start with that right now. When President Trump says Make America Great Again, as an African American woman who's also Cherokee in heritage on both sides of my family, I have to ask, which era of greatness do you want to go back to? Because from my heritage and background, as I reflect on the history of our country, there are many time periods and histories that I don't personally want to go back to, and I don't see those periods as great for me and for Black people, for Native American people, and in many cases for other people of color as well. So when I think back to my great grandparents on my father's side, they were enslaved on a slave plantation in Virginia. So was that a great time? Should we go back there? I dare say not. When I think of my grandmother and how she grew up and how she raised her children on that plantation, it was under tremendous hardship and conditions that were very severe and very difficult. They were not even able to afford to live in a decent way, let alone have enough finances to get off the plantation until her children grew up and left Virginia. So her sons mostly went into the military, and her daughters went north to work as housekeepers in the homes of well to do white families. So when I think back to that time and recognize that healthcare, for example, was mostly unavailable or extremely limited for Black people, and there was a subsistence living still on that slave plantation. And I say, was that the great time that we want to go back to? Shall we go back there? And I still say no. And then thirdly, I would say my father, he lived in Virginia on that plantation as well. And he lived there during the time of the terror of the Night Riders, the precursors to the Ku Klux Klan. And his mother, during these raids in the middle of the night, had to make sure that her sons were in the house so she could keep them from harm and from being killed. And then the Jim Crow laws were in effect that separated people by color, and what was supposed to be separate and equal was truly separate and unequal. That's what was going on. Lynchings were very common and rampant, and disenfranchisement of the formerly enslaved was definitely in place. From education, difficult to get an education. Prior to my father's age group, you could only go to the junior high school level. And I remember as a young boy going to elementary school, he had to walk several miles to get to the school through the woods, through logs over bodies of water, and he had to learn how to kill snakes along the way. Not what you want your kindergartner doing in today's time. And by the time he got to high school, they finally had put in a bus that would allow him to get from where he lived to the Black school that he was authorized to go to. Mind you, he passed many white schools along the way, from elementary school even all the way up through the high school era. Education was hard to achieve. Most people only went to the third or fourth grade. Those who were more fortunate finished junior high, and then they were back in the fields, working the fields on those plantations again. Economic opportunities, again, were limited. So I say, was that the great time about making America great again? Is that where we want to go back to? And again, I say no. Later, when my father moved to the Mid Atlantic region from Virginia, and at this point, he's a high school graduate, yet he wasn't free to eat at any lunch counter in the region, nor was he free to pursue any job that he might be interested in. He identified a few jobs that he knew that Black men were able to pursue, and he pursued those. His life was fraught with a lot of racism and segregation, both of which were rampant even in the mid Atlantic states. And so I say again, was that the great time? Is that where we want to go back to? And again, I say no. And in my case, I grew up in a time when legally you could go into restaurants, legally you could go into department stores, but that didn't mean that you would be welcomed. It did not mean that you would truly be served in those places. It did not mean that you could really shop there. It didn't mean you could really eat there. People would ignore you. They would not wait on you. You could not purchase your purchase, and you could not eat in those restaurants and many places. I also went to school in a place and under conditions where the parents were picketing outside the school because they did not want Black students there. And so I had to face that on multiple days of going to school. Is that the great space we want to go back to? Do we want to go back there? And again, I would say no. After slavery, after Jim Crow, we then also had a period in this country which is still in existence, and I would call it the prison industrial complex, where Black men are disproportionately sentenced to years of hard labor in prison camps for crimes that they did not commit. And we're finding out now from DNA that they were not the perpetrators of many of those crimes, or for minor crimes for which their white counterparts were not imprisoned. So I say, is that the great America that we want to go back to? Is that the place we want to be? And again, I say no. Then if I dial it way, way back, if I dial it back to when the first ships landed here in the New World and landed on the shores, and my Native American ancestors were on their lands and property here in the New World, and they were shot, they were killed, they were dispossessed of their land, they were promised treaties and provisions in treaties, all of which were broken. And then they were made to go on death marches, such as the death marches called the Trail of Tears, which particularly and disproportionately affected the Cherokee people. This was back in the years between 1830 and 1850, and especially 1838 and 1839 under President Andrew Jackson. This Trail of Tears was part of the Indian removal policy that really forced those in the South and the Southeast to move and migrate to the West on foot, mind you. And this Trail of Tears has been traced at about 2,200 miles across 9 different states. It affected the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek people. And with respect to the Cherokees, about 16,000 went on this horrific march, and 4,000, at least 4,000 died. So that's about anywhere from a fourth to a third of this group of Cherokees were killed in the Trail of Tears. And so again, I say, is this the place of greatness that we want to go back to? Is that what we're talking about? Now, I know that our country represents more than just these particular vignettes that I'm sharing with you that have personal significance and relevance for me. And if you've listened to me for any length of time, you know that I strongly believe in the Ghanaian principle of Sankofa, which says that there is value in going back and bringing forward that which is beneficial and of value for your people today and in the future. I only ask that former President Donald Trump identify what is it that he really is bringing forward, and for whom are these benefits? Who will benefit from this Make America Great Again campaign? So, which of these values, for whom is it going to be a good idea? And how does he plan to achieve this greatness? And I haven't heard a whole lot yet that would make me feel as though I should sign up for any of it. So I'm going to turn my attention now to Vice President Kamala Harris. And at the time of this recording, she hasn't had very much time to put her campaign together as of yet. Although one of the pillars that she's standing on is the pillar of her as the prosecutor, and she was referred to President Donald Trump as the convicted criminal. Now, she spent some time talking about how, because of her experience as a district attorney, she is strong enough to deal with some of the toughest people out there. And she's not afraid of former President Donald Trump. Well, that's a good way to think about this prosecutor piece, just in case we have forgotten her background, to know that she's got the tenacity, she's got the grit, she's got the ability to stand up to even a very difficult candidate. Now, I also would say, if I was her advisor, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time there because, again, in this country, there are many Americans who feel that they've been unfairly and improperly treated by the criminal justice system. They've been prosecuted for, again, crimes they did not commit, and they've been imprisoned unfairly and in different ways. Again, that's a form of disenfranchisement. So you don't want to camp out there too long enough to say, yep, we know you got the power and strength to move forward, even in a difficult situation. Now, when she talks about the future, and she does talk about the future, so her vision is not just past or retrospective, it is about moving forward. And she talks about every American having a chance to get ahead. And that's what the whole country is about, the American dream. She also talks about building up the middle class, having the freedom to vote, and dealing with gun violence that has really caused the deaths of so many people. She also talks about freedom in this country to include reproductive freedom and returning power of the people. Now, what we need to hear more about is exactly how does she plan to build up the middle class? In what ways will people have a chance to get ahead that maybe they haven't experienced in a long time or haven't experienced lately? What is she going to do to ensure that Americans have the freedom to vote, or that we are not going to be the victims of violent crimes, to include with weapons such as assault rifles and so on? So we want to hear more about the exact details and what she plans to do. We want to hear more about what does she stand for, and this applies to all the candidates, what they stand for more than what they're reacting against. What is the proactive platform? And right now, because Vice President Kamala Harris is just starting out and she can see what the others have been doing, she has an opportunity to not take the bait, not to fall into the trap of running a negative campaign. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is running as an independent candidate, and he stands for American freedoms. Our country is based on freedom. And in particular, he's standing for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, And this is at a time when people with differing views are being shut down and deplatformed. And of course, this is of interest to me as a person who's in the public arena, a person who's in the media. Yeah, I would like to ensure that we have freedom of speech, freedom of the press. He also talks about freedom of personal choice and agency in healthcare situations, and especially as they relate to vaccines and so-called vaccines. And this is of interest to me as well, as a person who's had a lot of negative reactions to pharmaceutical medications. There is no one size fits all. We're all different, and we all have to have the agency to make some decisions for ourselves. He's also talked about how important it is to preserve the healthy food sources and to make sure that food crops are grown in a sustainable and healthy manner. And he stands a lot on environmental issues. He has chosen as his vice presidential running mate Nicole Shanahan, who's 38 years old from California. She's a lawyer, she's a philanthropist, and she's never been in the elected political system before. So, what I would say to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, how will you increase your visibility? Because most people probably haven't even heard very much about what your platform is. And how will you get this done? The visibility and also these issues that you care about, how will you make those come to fruition and make them happen? How can you win the election? And if you don't win, which candidate is advantage? Which candidate is disadvantage as a result, because people are voting for you instead of one of the two primary candidates. And if you don't win, what is the advantage of your candidacy to the American people? Because at the end of the day, it's all about what is going to be useful and beneficial to the American people, and what are you, any candidate, bringing to the table on that front. So in that first point, I'm simply saying, have a vision for the future. Be able to lay out how you will realize that vision. Don't be mired in the past, because we can't go back to the past to change anything. And some of that past, for many of us, we do not wish to repeat. So future focus with a compelling vision that people want to sign up for. Whether you agree with his politics or not, one of the real strong characteristics of President Barack Obama in his first term was that he had a forward focusing vision that said, yes, we can. And he talked about and articulated many aspects of that. My second piece of advice and counsel to the candidates is this: address the issues of most importance to the American people. On both the Democratic and the Republican sides, we have a lot of special interest groups. We have a lot of far left or far right leaning entities that want to utilize the party to get some things done that are really, frankly, less important to the American person that's generally sitting home and paying attention to the election. So I made a list of some issues that I think American people care about. And as I go over these issues, they're not in any particular order. However, they're all related to the ability of each citizen to take care of their families and to leave an inheritance for their children and their children's children. And that inheritance includes financial and otherwise. What about the inheritance of a people of decency and with good character? For example, I know that my father grew up very, very poor, and yet his mother was very clear. She did not want any of her children to be ever guilty of stealing anything. It'll be legitimately accused of theft or thievery or any other crime. She raised them to have respect for themselves, respect for the law, and to do what was right, even though they did not benefit from any government assistance or anything of that nature. She wanted her children to be honorable. And yet today, sometimes when I'm out and about, I see people blatantly engaging in actions that are lawless. My grandmother would be turning over in her grave to see that that's what some people are choosing to do. However, she did not raise her children in that way. So all of this is about American people being able to take care of their families, which means having good job and career opportunities. It means paying attention to the economy. People are concerned about the increasing cost of goods and services and goods that are necessary for life, like food and shelter and clothing. People are concerned about inflation increasing, about budget deficits continuing to go up. Our debt is so high, we are beginning to wonder, can it ever be paid off? What is that going to cause for our children and our children's children? American citizens are concerned about viable and affordable options and choices for education and for getting the skills that they need to be in the workforce in a great way. It's not always college, it could be a trade school or whatever is appropriate for whatever that person's career interest is. People are concerned about taxes. Will we tax people so much that they're essentially working for the government and they don't really have enough take home pay to care for their families? And are they taxed so much, if you will, they can't even plan for their own retirements? Will this mean that they're in the workplace for the rest of their lives until they die? People are concerned about taxes and the way that they're eroding the wealth of each citizen and their families. People are concerned about housing, affordable housing. Many people today aren't even able to afford a house if they want one. It's people in the younger generations. And that is unfortunate because we've always sort of prided ourselves in this country that people could purchase a home at some point in time if they chose to do so. So affordable housing is an issue as well. And we're concerned about wars, whether they're on our soil or not. There's a concern about the war with Ukraine and Russia, a concern about the war with Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah. We are concerned about those wars. We're concerned about how should we treat our international relationships, our allies. How much do we support them? And when do we withhold support? Or should we withhold support? All of these are questions that need to be answered. And what happens if we don't support Ukraine in the war? What happens if we don't support Israel in the war? What are the downstream consequences of those decisions? And at the same time, how do we care about all lives in the process? The lives of those people who are being killed on whatever side they may be on. I think that American people are also concerned about freedom for personal agency and in choice. We have always been the land of opportunity, that land of the American dream where you did have personal agency and choice. You did not have to remain in a particular caste or the place from which you might have been born. Hi, it's Dr. Karen here, and I hope that you are enjoying today's show. Just wanted to drop in to remind you that succession is an intentional process. So remember to contact me to figure out how best to create that culture of development so that you have a successor when you're ready to leave and go to the next step in your life. You can reach me at Dr. Karen, Karen, at transleadership.com. Now enjoy the rest of the show. We're also concerned in this country about healthcare that's affordable, that's accessible, and that's effective. Healthcare that not only addresses you when you're on your last leg and deathbed, that's also preventative in nature. And we tend to be in the United States more of a sick care culture than a true healthcare culture. So that's an issue. 10, there's the concern about energy out there and which energy sources are we going to use? And if we're moving towards newer energy sources, cleaner energy sources, do we have enough to go around? Will we be able to function and maintain the lifestyle that we now have Or will there be some tremendous and significant shortfalls that may affect a person's livelihood? And I don't mean just not having the job you want. People might die from starvation. People might die from not having heat or whatever the situation is, or not having air conditioning. So energy is important. There are also the consequences of weather and national disasters. As climate change is taking place, we are seeing that in many regions, there's more hurricanes, more floods, there are earthquakes and fires, and so much that's going on. And the devastation that comes on the back end of that, that affects the ability to feed our families again, affects the ability to be gainfully employed. People are definitely concerned about crime, and particularly violent crime with weapons, and they're concerned about drugs. And even as drugs are being legalized in different places, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a positive landscape. In Colorado, we have already had a significantly increased number of highway fatalities since the time of legalizing marijuana in our state. And there are also other implications when we have drugs rampant, both legal and illegal. People are concerned about immigration. We've been a country who's been open to immigration. Most of us who are here did not originate here. And so we need to have reasonable and appropriate immigration policies in place. People need to know what those policies are. There has to be a pathway for coming to the United States. And for those who may have been here for many generations, who got here through an illegal means, some way to even deal with the fact that they've been here now for generations and contributing to our society. What is the fix for that as well? People are also concerned about poverty and about homelessness that results from some of the other issues that I've mentioned so far. Now, that's just a short list. There are other things which I did not put on that list, and I didn't put on there anything that I thought was maybe at one extreme or the next. These are issues that we all can be concerned about, whether Democrat, Republican, or independent. In addition to addressing these issues, and that's what the candidates ought to be talking about those issues and how they're planning to deal with them, address them, and create conditions for the American people that are better than what they were before. And then thirdly, I think it's important to talk about why you, as a candidate, are the best person for the job for right now and what's going on in our country and in our world. What experiences are you bringing? What strengths and gifts and abilities that we need at the moment? And how do you plan to leverage those gifts, strengths, and abilities for the benefit of the populace, of the American people? That's one thing to answer. And in addition, how does your vice presidential selection, how is that an asset for the country? How does it balance you as presidential nominee? How does it balance you, because your vice presidential candidate has different strengths, different gifts and talents, and the two of you together are complementary? Just like in a good marriage, you want to be agreed on the big things like the values that you stand behind and what's important, and yet have some different styles. One of you may be introverted, the other may be extroverted. One may be a detail person, one may be a big picture person. You're bringing different abilities to the mix for the greater good, and president and vice president can also do that if they're intentional and if they think about it. You also want that vice presidential selection that you make to be able to appeal perhaps to other segments of the population than what you alone would appeal to. Now, if you just hire in your own image and get someone just like you, you're both covering the same segment of the waterfront. And there are others in the waterfront who are left out. They have no reason to vote for you. So there is this whole notion of having unity in the diversity of gifts that you as presidential nominee and your vice presidential selection that you bring together. And then fourthly, and I think this is hugely important, how will you work across the aisle to create unity in the country and to find common ground and to get to what I call the third solution? And you've heard me speak of this before. The third solution is not what I think about on my own and alone, not what you think about alone and on your own. It's what we create together when we come together, share our perspectives, consider all different angles around the issue, and we come up with something that's better than what either one of us thought of on our own, and we would not have come up with it on our own. So I think there's room for Republicans, Democrats, and even independents to have some dialogue that takes the country to a better place, and one that, as my colleague Deke Copenhaver would say, that's not polarized. And so we want the candidates to be thinking about how they will work across the aisle. And Vice President Kamala Harris talked about how that President Joe Biden was a good role model for her in this respect because he often was holding out that olive branch to figure out how he could work together with Republicans to come up with solutions and moving forward. And hopefully she can extend that legacy if she moves forward. And I'd like to hear more about former President Trump's plan to also reach across the aisle. And we know that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his family, Ted Kennedy in particular, was very good at reaching across the aisle. To what extent does he have those abilities? And maybe he needs to talk about that a little bit. And then fifthly, I would say to all of the candidates is to resist the temptation to run a fear-based and mudslinging campaign where you're focused on tearing down the other candidates in the race rather than focusing on the issues. I think that would be a mistake. And there are a lot of mechanisms afoot to really try to bait people into that reactive stance. And I would say fight against it, because the more you fall into that trap, we're not going to hear about your future vision. We're not going to hear about what you're going to do about the issues that are of most importance to the American population. So in summarizing these again, I think it's really important for each candidate to articulate and cast their compelling future-focused vision, not the past, future-focused vision. I think it's very important for each candidate to proactively address the issues of importance to the American people, more than giving the bulk of your attention to special interest groups, fringe issues, and extreme issues. Much more important to focus on what the vast majority of American people are concerned about and care about. Thirdly, to be able to articulate why you, for this time, when we've been studying people in the Bible and we talked about Esther, Esther was in the palace for such a time as this. Why would you be in the White House now? What's the time right now that says you are the candidate, and how does your vice presidential selection, how does that person add value, complement you, and be better for the country? And then fourthly, how would you work across the aisle to create unity and use the collective intelligence and smarts that we have in this country? And those don't reside in just one party. And so we want to remember that. And then five, to resist that temptation again to run a fear-based and mudslinging campaign. You want to stay focused on the issues. Now, lest you think that I am against my country, the United States, let me reiterate that I am not. I love my country, the United States. I believe in the opportunities in our country, and our form of government. And I believe that opportunities that we would love are still possible. I also support the United States, and it's part of the reason that I served in the Army as an active duty Army officer. I could have chosen not to do that. I could have gotten out of it earlier than I did. I served the country because I wanted to, and I'm proud to have done so. Thirdly, I believe that our future can be better even than our past. And I'm looking forward to that. We've had some hard times and some hard years lately, and I still believe that our future can be better than our past. And as a child of God, as a believer in God, I also strongly believe that God is able. And I know that He is the one that is still sovereign over the nations. Nothing happens down here without Him being aware of it. And many things He allows, which we don't always understand. Why? Because some of what He allows causes us great suffering, and yet He has a plan that we may not understand. Because as God also reminds us, His ways are higher than our ways and greater than our ways. His thoughts way above ours. And what He's accomplishing and what He's doing, even through hardships that we go through, may be more beneficial than we know because we don't see and we don't know all as He does. And I will just remind you that God is the one that put families in places. He's the one that created languages and communications, and He set up some boundaries with lands and territories, not all, but He certainly set up some and allowed them. And He is the one that has created government as a way for us to operate down here on the earth. And I want to read some verses from Romans 13 about what is said in God's new covenant about the government. It says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For He is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for He does not bear the sword in vain. For He is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due: taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And we know that in the history of God in our world, He's the one who's turned the hearts of kings to benefit His people whenever He saw fit, whether those kings believed in Him or not, whether those kings worshiped Him or not, whether those kings even liked His people or not. And we know that King Ahasuerus of the Persian kingdom, he intervened to save the Jewish people at a critical time. And we talked about this not too long ago when Queen Esther was in the palace for such a time as this. We know that he moved on the heart of Cyrus to help his people go back to their promised land at the right time and to rebuild. So God, whether you believe in Him or not, is still sovereign over the nations. He can whisper and speak to a king in his night dreams and lead him to what he should do on this earth if God wants him to do something in particular. They serve at His bidding, and He can remove kings whenever He feels like it too, and that includes presidents because they may not be fulfilling the purpose for which he called them. And we have to remember that God is the great king. He is the king, first of all, and all other kings are subordinate. We have to remember that he gave all power and authority to his Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is known as the King of Kings. And so all of this following of the government is not carte blanche. We are to obey the government and follow them until they violate one of God's principles. When they violate something that God has already told us to do, then as the Apostle Paul is famous for saying, well, you judge, should we obey God or obey you? And the answer was obvious. No, we're not going to obey you, man. We're obeying God, who is the true king, and Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. And I want to just draw your attention to an account that is in the book of Acts. It's Acts, the 12th chapter, and this is a picture of an earthly ruler who did not give glory and honor to God. And we're going to see what God does with this individual. This individual, by the way, was persecuting the church at the time. He was one of the Herods that we see in the early church history. He killed James, one of the apostles, who was the brother of John. He killed him with the sword. He also put Peter, one of the apostles, in prison, although we know that Peter got out of prison because God delivered him out of the prison situation. So this Herod is persecuting the church, and we already know that Jesus Christ said that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. That is still true today. We see hard times. We see difficulty. Martyrs are dying every day. And yet the church is still alive. And in some of the places where the church is most persecuted, it is growing the fastest and the largest. And so God's promise is still true that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. So in Acts, the 12th chapter, we read this account about Herod. And I'm going to start this reading in the 21st verse of the 12th chapter of Acts. And it says, "So on a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them." That's the people who were gathered around. "And the people kept shouting, 'The voice of a God and not of a man.'" Imagine this. They're saying, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give glory to God, and he was eaten by worms and died. Wow. And it still said that, but the word of God grew and multiplied in spite of all of this. So God knows how to handle the rulers of the world. And if the candidate that you think should win does not win, remember, we are still called to pray for our leaders, no matter who they are, because we pray for them, because that's what causes things to go well for us in the land. We want God to bless us in the land, and that means praying for our leaders, even if they're problematic people, even if it's not the one who you think should have won. God has a purpose, God has a reason, and he knows how to replace those who are not doing what he wants them to do at a particular time and season. So more than even trusting in this country and in the electorate, I trust in God and what he is doing in the greater landscape. And in the Lord's Prayer, that prayer that continues is that God's will be done on earth, even as it is in heaven. We know that in heaven, everything is moving in the direction that God has ordained. The earth is kind of out of control right now. There will be a time when the earth comes under the leadership and direction of God also. And in the meantime, those of us who follow God and who are serving him here, we are to love our fellow human beings who are around us. We are to pray for those who despitefully use us and do wrong. We are to pray for those who are in positions of leadership and ask for direction, ask for guidance before you go to the polls so that God will give you a vision about who you should vote for in this election. And I say, may God's person win the election. May God be able to get the glory through whoever is elected president of the United States. And if you are listening from another country, your prayers are just as good for your leaders as well. So appeal to God. Let him know you believe in his power and authority over all things, because he is the God of gods. There's no one greater than God. He is the King, and his Messiah is the King of Kings. Bless you today and every day. Hi, this is Dr. Karen Wilson Starks, President and CEO of Trans Leadership Incorporated. Did you know that workplaces can make a significant difference in the lives of people, and that you can create a positive culture that gets positive business results and also produces positive life experiences for your employees and your clients and customers? You can make a significant contribution to the world by creating the kind of culture where your people can bring their gifts to provide the most relevant and excellent products and services to your marketplace. What the research shows is that companies with excellent leadership are also more profitable. So as you flourish and as you grow in the world, you can do more for yourself as well as for others. So if this is resonating with you and you want to create a positive, profitable, and powerful corporate culture, and you care about succession, leaving the organization in a better position than when you found it, do keep in mind that that kind of legacy is something that's intentional. And I am happy to partner with you to take your organization to the next level and create that positive leadership culture. So reach me at Dr. Karen, Karen, at transleadership.com. You've been listening to The Voice of Leadership with me, Dr. Karen Wilson Starks. And I want to give a special thanks to jazz saxophonist Ron McMillan for granting us permission to use his gifted music on our show. Thanks for listening, and remember to go to my website, transleadership.com, for more strategies, insights, and leadership resources.